Welcome, beer theologians. This is Around the Word in Many Glasses. Today, we will be drinking Hofbrau Original, and we'll be talking about Psalm 120. So kick back, relax, pour yourself a drink, and let's get to it. Today, we have the first beer for the channel. It's not my usual kind of beer, actually. It's I think the name or the style of this beer is called a Munchen. It's German beer for sure. That I have no question. It even says German purity laws on here, which who knows? Maybe we'll talk about that today. Those German purity laws are interesting. Where they come from and kind of why they're still around and all that. But this isn't my typical style of beer. I usually drink the darker stuff, the stouts, the porters, and I love Oktoberfest. I do like German beer as well, but this is, well, not that. It's not, well, it is German. It's not a dark beer. I think it's, it's more of a light beer. I don't know exactly what I would describe it as. But like I said, it's not my typical beer. So I have it today, and this is the first beer we're using today, because this was a gift to me from one of my members. And I've had a few of these already, so cheers, especially if you do end up watching this. Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed these, more than I was expecting even. So cheers, or Prost even. I don't know if you've experienced as a beer drinker, but I think we all kind of get into our ruts, like I said, especially in winter. All I drink are stouts. It's almost not worth it for me if I'm not going for a stout, so I don't bother. And so especially this time of year, I wanted to purchase this on my own, which is why I'm so glad it was given to me, because it's something that I wouldn't be drinking otherwise. But if you get like that, where you get into ruts, and I found it especially true with beer, when you kind of go away from that, you can get almost surprised. It's like tasting the style of beer all over again for the first time. And that was my experience with this. I opened it up actually on Christmas Day, after my son had finished ripping open his presents after we had come home from the service, and thinking, I'll just enjoy a beer, nothing special. But when I opened it, and it has the I think the foremost quality of this one is that it's a yeasty beer, which is not something you get a lot of, at least not something I get a lot of. I think most people nowadays, if you look at least at the stores, IPAs are everywhere. So those are really hop forward. And stouts kind of stuff I like, that's really malt forward, right? So it's the grains going in. You can't really be water forward. I mean, that water's just water. And so that's 3 of the 4 ingredients. So the only thing you have left is the yeast. And I think that yeast doesn't really come to the forefront very often. At least it's not really popular to have beers that do that. But I've always found myself pleasantly surprised, really refreshing, when I do have a beer where the yeast is forward. They usually look a lot like this. They're a very light color. This one's very clear. When I think of kind of yeast forward beers, I often think of like Hefeweizens, which obviously have a lot of wheat in them and all that kind of stuff. There's that wheat character coming through, but they have that distinct yeasty flavor. They taste like a brewery smells, and if you've ever been inside of a brewery, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So, for those who gave this to me, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed them. This is actually the second to last one that I have. I've been saving these the last couple, at least this one in particular, for this. So, cheers once again. So, let's get on to, what I'm a little bit more knowledgeable in, the Psalms. I mentioned in a previous video that I had this idea to kind of go through the Psalms of Ascent, thinking that Psalm 26 with, "O Lord, I love the habitation of your house and the place where your glory dwells," was part of that series, part of that set of Psalms of Ascent. And spoiler, it's not. But I figured I'll go through the Psalms of Ascent anyway. I think they're a really neat kind of collection of Psalms. If you're unfamiliar with the Psalms of Ascent, I can give you a little bit of a background. this isn't really my area. But the Psalms of Ascent are a category of psalms. They're, I think, probably the easiest category to find, because once you found one of them, you found all of them. So with other types of psalms like the confession or the praise psalms or the imprecatories or all these other categories of psalms that we have, they're spread throughout the Psalter. They're there isn't necessarily any rhyme or reason. Well, there's a little bit of rhyme or reason to where all these psalms are coming in, but they're not necessarily ordered thematically in any way. But that's not true with the Psalms of Ascent. Psalms of Ascent are Psalm 120 through whichever one it ends with. Like I said, this isn't quite as polished as one of my classes would be, where I could tell you off the top of my head what the final Psalm of Ascent is. These are all psalms that are collected together. All of the Psalms of Ascent are just one after another, after another, after another. So why are they called the Psalms of Ascent? Where do we get that name from? Well, the Psalms of Ascent get their name, from what I understand, because these were a set of psalms that were used by the Israelites on their pilgrimage to Jerusalem every year. So if you don't know what that's all about, every year the Israelites would travel around, I'm pretty sure it was the Day of Atonement. They would travel to Jerusalem so that they could be part of the Day of Atonement sacrifices there, which Day of Atonement has all sorts of Christological connections that we're just not going to make, at least not today, not with Day of Atonement connection. We're going to talk about Christ for sure, because I do think he's in this psalm, as I think he's probably in all of the psalms. But every year, the Israelites would travel to Jerusalem. They would travel up to Jerusalem. And that's kind of the way it's phrased. You go up to Jerusalem. You never go to or down to Jerusalem. You're always going up to Jerusalem. And the reason that you always said you were going up to Jerusalem is a very simple reason. It has nothing to do with some grand theological understanding about the city or anything. Nothing like that. You went up to Jerusalem because it was the highest place. It was a city set on a hill, which is a good thing, right? It helps you defend the city if you're on top of the hill. Everyone who watches Star Wars knows the importance of the high ground. And so you would go up to Jerusalem. And then even more than that, the highest place in Jerusalem, or at least the highest significant place, I don't know if it's necessarily the highest, is the Temple Mount. And that is, if people are traveling on this pilgrimage to go to Jerusalem for the Day of Atonement, the temple and the sacrifices that take place there are kind of a key feature of what they're doing. And so it was said that you would go up to Jerusalem and then you'd go up to the temple and you were ascending. Hence our title, the Psalms of Ascent. Now, from what I understand, we don't necessarily know how exactly these psalms were used on these pilgrimages. We know that they were used on the pilgrimages. We don't know exactly what they were doing with them. So what I mean to say is, were these psalms that were used during worship and personal devotion on the way to Jerusalem? Were these the psalms that were prayed by the people as they approached the city? Or were these psalms used as part of the actual Day of Atonement rituals and worship that went along with all of that? We're not entirely sure. When I was in seminary, we had an assignment for our Psalms and the Writings class where we were supposed to journal our way through some of the psalms. So read the psalms, a certain number of psalms, and then journal our way through them. And I chose the Psalms of Ascent. Mostly because they were all in one convenient place. I didn't have to go looking for them and spend the extra 5 minutes of Googling, what are the Psalms of Confession or anything like that. I just found the first one and was off to the races. So I did the Psalms of Ascent. And I do remember, I don't have that notebook anymore. I don't know where it went. But I do remember that I had convinced myself as I was journaling through these Psalms that they were used incrementally over the whole journey. And I don't have the notebook, so I can't see where I made these notes and what exactly I was thinking. But I do remember thinking, oh, this is probably the psalm that they read when they first saw the city, right? So just as the city comes over the horizon, everyone stops and prays this psalm, or that's the triggering point in your mind for you to sing it, or to just speak it or to think it personally. Oh, this is probably the psalm that they used when they were walking up the steps to the temple. So for no other reason than it kind of felt right to me, I think that's how they were used. Again, I have no evidence. I'm sure people have better arguments for how and why these psalms were used that way, but that was just the feeling that I got as I was reading through them. So I think that's enough on kind of what the Psalms of Ascent are, especially because, as I said, I'm by no means an expert in the Psalms nor the Psalms of Ascent. So I think the best thing to do at this point is to actually read the first Psalm of Ascent. It's very short. It's not a long psalm at all. So the first of the Psalms of Ascent is Psalm 120, which in many ways does make it kind of easy to find because it's after the longest chapter of the Bible, right? That's one of those trivia questions everyone likes. So what's the longest chapter in the Bible? It's Psalm 119. And so you find the longest chapter in the Bible. It takes a couple pages. Then you just go to the next one, and that's the first Psalm of Ascent. And we go from a massive psalm to a very short one, just 7 verses long. So here it is, a song of ascents, Psalm 120. In my distress I called to the Lord, and he answered me. Deliver me, O Lord, from lying lips, from a deceitful tongue. And what shall be given to you? And what more shall be done to you, you deceitful tongue? A warrior's sharp arrows, with glowing coals of the broom tree. Woe to me that I sojourn in Meshech, that I dwell among the tents of Kedar. Too long have I had my dwelling among those who hate peace. I am for peace, but when I speak, they are for war. It's a short psalm, and it comes to us in 3 sections, 3 units, which is very easy for me to see because I'm looking at it, and it's harder for you. But if you look in your Bibles, you'll see these paragraph divisions. At least they're in mine, so I'm going to say that it comes to us in 3 sections. So we'll take them in those 3 chunks and kind of deal with them as we will, recognizing, again, this is a goal I have with the Psalms. Read them as we are the author, and then read them as if Christ is the one speaking, or if they are speaking of Christ. So we'll take this apart piece by piece and kind of do a little bit of that. So our first section is the first 2 verses. In my distress I called to the Lord, and he answered me. Deliver me, O Lord, from lying lips, from a deceitful tongue. I may rely on this a little bit too much as we go on, although it's also possible that it's not possible for me to rely on it too much. But I'm reminded in reading this of the Passion of Christ, of course. Some other things come to mind, but that's definitely the first one, where we have Christ really going to his death, at least from an earthly perspective, because of lies and deceits, because of those lying lips and the deceitful tongue. That's really what drives Christ to the cross. Again, at least from an earthly standpoint. We remember early in the Passion as Jesus is on trial before the Sanhedrin. And the Sanhedrin was just bringing in false witnesses over and over and over again. Some presumably just flat out lying, and others twisting Jesus' words so that they seem to say something that they didn't. And so I see at least here Christ. In my distress, I called to the Lord. It seems to be why Christ is definitely in a position of distress in Holy Week. I don't think there's any 2 ways about that. He is definitely in a distressful position. I'm sure we would all feel the same way, although we certainly didn't have the same sort of well, divine nature that Christ has, which certainly changed uh, his experience of Holy Week. Although I'm not always sure it was more comforting. Because again, part of that divine nature is that he's taking on the sin of the world. He has been having all of the sins, all of these lies, these deceitful tongues and lying lips, all the sins they're committing are being heaped upon Christ as he prepares to go to die. And more than that, die for sins, which includes with it the worst of the punishments of the cross, which is separation from the Father, which is one of those mind-blowing sorts of things that I don't think we talk about very much because it's a bit too hard for us to really wrap our brains around because we flat out can't. Answering that question or really truly understanding how it is that the Son and the Father can be separated from each other. We know what happened. We have no idea what that means or how that's possible. It's too big for us. But we do see that the Lord answers the speaker of the psalm. We're not told how. We don't actually see the deliverance of the individual here. Perhaps because it is a psalm of ascent, and we do have that Day of Atonement, or at least going up to the temple in mind. Perhaps we can see that this deliverance is coming from the temple, or more specifically, more pointedly, that deliverance is coming from the sacrifices that occurred there, coming from in a shadow form, right? In a I've lost the term, typological way. The answer to this distress comes from the cross backwards through time, and at least for us, it comes forward if we are praying this. Let's go on to the second section. It's the next two verses. What shall be given to you, and what more shall be done to you, you deceitful tongue? A warrior's sharp arrows with glowing coals of the broom tree. Now, this is a theme in Scripture, I think. It's one I've not really spent a whole lot of time thinking through, at least for myself. I know a lot of people have spent time on this, is this idea of the lies and the deceit, and how truly powerful and destructive they are. We see lies and deceit really plunging humanity into sin. It's right there from the beginning in the garden, where the serpent is lying. Or maybe not lying, but being deceitful, if not outright lying, to Adam and Eve to convince them to eat of the fruit. James is the first place that my mind went, right? Where James talks about how the tongue is like the rudder of a ship, right? The words that you speak can destroy you, just like a rudder can destroy a massive ship. This small thing can destroy you, and destroy others in this sense. We've already talked about how lies make it into the Passion account. This is, I think, a theme of how utterly destructive words can be. A thought has just occurred to me, so I have no idea if it's relevant here, is I wonder if Scripture spends so much time on the destructive power of words that humans twist to destroy because of, well, who Christ is, right? In Greek, he is the divine logos, right? He is the word of God. His word is truth. His word is perfect. His word is righteous, just, upholding. It's creative, right? Christ is the word that spoke everything into existence. And so I wonder if there's a connection there between the holy and divine word and well, not necessarily the connection between their word and our misuse of our words, because don't get me wrong, we do not have divine power in our words, right? There are those out there who think that. I would say that they're wrong. If you disagree with me, comment, and maybe we can talk about that in a little bit more detail. So our words are definitely not words like God's words, but maybe that's why, I guess maybe a better way of putting this is perhaps because of who God is, and he's that speaking, that the word of truth, that creative word, maybe that's why these sins are so egregious to him. Why they come up so often, because the words are supposed to be truth. Words are supposed to be about him and his truth, and we misuse that. What could be used as a picture, an image, or even just less metaphorical, directing people to God, we so often twist and don't make about God. And so we see here the word is compared, right, to the archer's arrow or a fire of the broom tree, the coals, the destructive fire. I'm thinking that there might be a reference there. It's another thing that has just occurred to me, so I don't know if it is. In Judges, I think it's Judges, or I think what I'm thinking of may or may not be in Judges. But I know in Judges, one of these guys is stuck in a tower, and they start lighting fires underneath it. I wonder if there's a reference to broom trees being what they lit on fire. That's something to possibly look into. Might be a connection that we can make there, or it might be completely irrelevant and not connected in any way, shape, or form. But either way, we see this destructive power of fire and the tongue being compared to that. James compares the tongue to a fire, doesn't he? Anyway, you can look that up. Like I said, this is not nearly as polished as a sermon or anything. It's kind of the ramblings of a pastoral mind, at least. In our last section, the final 3 verses. Woe to me, that I sojourn in Meshech, that I dwell among the tents of Kedar. Too long have I had my dwelling among those who hate peace. I am for peace, but when I speak, they are for war. I don't want to really deal with the first verse, the one with the place names, because quite frankly, I don't recognize those names, so I can't talk about them or what they are. I mean, clearly, the author doesn't want to be there. And so I would guess that there's connections to war and strife simply because of what follows. But I do want to spend time on those last 2 verses. I think when we put these in the mouth of Christ, I think they become very profound and impactful. Too long have I had my dwelling among those who hate peace. I am for peace. When I speak, they are for war. What better way to characterize the ministry of Christ? He was here to bring peace, right? Now, there are some verses where Christ talks about how he did not come to bring peace. He came to bring a sword, but he's talking about something different there, right? We see, right, Handel's Messiah, that Isaiah passage. It's Christmas time around here. Just barely. We're almost out of the Christmas season, but at least when I'm filming this, by the time I upload it, we'll probably be out of Christmas. But Isaiah calls him the Prince of Peace, right? Christ has not come into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world. These sorts of things, right? He's not come to destroy, to make war and to kill. Instead, he's come to make alive. He's the opposite, in fact. And yes, that will bring about overthrow in political arenas and will spark wars. I mean, we can see that, even though probably some asterisks and some more things to be said about the wars that come about because of Christianity and the role that Christianity may or may not have played in that. I think a lot of it has to do with sinful people. That's a topic for another day. But Christ is here to bring peace, and he's among people of war. Not necessarily in the literal sense, but he's among people who sin. Sin brings death, and sometimes it's very literal, with people killing one another, with people killing Christ. Sometimes it's more figurative, or at least more theological. I think is probably a better way to say that. Where we see that sin brings about death, your death and others' death as well. So Christ is that man of peace, dwelling among people of war. And I suspect he probably tired of it by the end of his ministry. He was probably sick of living in a sinful world. And we know God hates sin. I mean, can you imagine being a holy God being forced to live in a sinful creation? He did it for us, but I don't think we often think about that. The constant pain that Jesus was probably in simply because he was living in a world full of sin, a world of war and hatred. And he was there to to solve the problem. Don't get me wrong. He was there to change things, but I think there's probably a pain and a fatigue that caused within him. So I think it's not too much of a stretch to put these words into Christ's mouth. Too long have I had my dwelling among those who hate peace. I think that's why I particularly love the Gospel of Mark, because Jesus is on such a mission. Get me to the cross as fast as you can. He has some detours, but it almost seems like Jesus is goading people into killing him so that he can kind of get on with the business of saving people, get on with the business of fixing this broken world in which he's living. And then, of course, the final verse, I am for peace, but when I speak, they are for war. These words that the Prince of Peace speaks, these words of forgiveness, even. So often it's about forgiveness that just sparks the people to hatred. Absolute, utter, abject hatred of him. Sparks them to war. And so I think especially those last verses we should hear ringing in the mouth of Christ. He's that man of peace who tires of this sinful world that we inhabit. And he is, when he speaks peace, others speak violence against him, right? We see the persecution of the church throughout the ages. And the psalm ends there. I don't think we should. I think we need to push forward and recognize that, yes, Christ is probably fatigued of living in this world of sin, but also that he didn't just leave, right? The ascension is an important part of Christ's ministry, but it's not something he did before Good Friday, right? Good Friday and Easter Sunday come first. Christ didn't just get to the end of his teaching ministry, if you will, and say, bye guys, I'm done. I'm going to wait till you all figure this thing out and you stop making war and you begin to make peace, and then I'll come back. No. Christ, while in the midst of this war, fights the war. He does so in a strange way by not killing anyone, not attacking anyone, but instead not speaking any of those words, going silently to the slaughter to die for us, dying at the hands of these warlike men, peacefully in many ways, but dying so that he might utterly and completely destroy the wickedness that killed him. And that's where we come in reading the psalm. We can recognize that the Lord has delivered us. As we said at the beginning, we see Christ coming back through time and forward towards us. He is the one who has delivered us because he died and rose again on our behalf. Well, that's the first of the Psalms of Ascent. I think I'm going to do these, all the Psalms of Ascent. I'll do them one at a time. I'll stretch this out for as long as I possibly can. I hope you've enjoyed. I hope this encourages you maybe to go and read through the Psalms of Ascent. Maybe look up all those random references that came to my mind that may or may not be relevant. But as you go to do that, all those who wait on the Lord, let us raise a glass and drink to Christ's imminent return.